Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with faith leaders, academics, and social justice practitioners to talk about the intersections of faith, climate, and the social justice issues of our time. And this morning, we have on a good friend, Sarah Ogletree, who is the program coordinator for North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, a program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. Sarah, thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks for having me, Cody. I've been looking forward to this ever since it started.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing now, just briefly.
Okay, so I live in Western North Carolina in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I think I also grew up in this region. And I think growing up in that space really provided the foundation for me to do environmental justice work. I just felt deeply connected spiritually to this landscape. And then as a college student, learned about the realities of the climate crisis. And not just the scientific realities, but the justice pieces of that. And that really just changed the trajectory of my life. I also grew up in church. I grew up in First Baptist Church of Sylva, North Carolina. And growing up in the church also provided this foundation, because when I learned about the climate crisis, I viewed it as an issue of morality and an issue, a crisis of faith, and something that the church needed to be involved in. So that led me to divinity school, to the work I do today. And as program coordinator, I am the congregational contact point for faith communities in the state of North Carolina who want to be involved in this work of educating, inspiring, and mobilizing people of faith to address climate change as a moral imperative. And I do that programmatically through preaching, through conversations and organizing. And I also oversee our Youth Leaders Initiative, high school youth empowered, just incredible young climate activists who are doing really, really wonderful work from a place of faith. And I also work with a few interns, college students. So.
Great. Well, no shortage of work to be done.
Yeah, lots of different things going on for sure.
Well, I think you have an offering or a reading for us this morning, so I'll invite you to do that.
Yes, let me pull it up. Yeah, so I want to read this morning a poem by Yehuda Amichai, and I might read it twice because it's short, so it might give us a little bit of time to, chew on it. This is called The Place Where We Are Right. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. So I'm going to read that one more time. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood.
So say a little bit about why you brought that piece and what it means to you.
I love this poem so much. Yehuda Amichai is becoming one of my favorite poets pretty quickly. And I brought it for a few reasons. One is just as a human, separate from work, and also as a part of my work, I can lean into perfectionism. So personally, this poem is helpful to me to remember that the place where we are right, or the place where I think I'm right, is not the place where I'm going to grow and flower and be able to lean into the hard and courageous work that I want to do and that I feel called to. I also love this poem kind of as a meditation on climate activism or movement work, because I think sometimes, and I do this, I can be kind of cynical. We can fall into an apocalyptic narrative of what the climate crisis means. And I think that that's grounded in science, and there's reasons why we do that. But the idea that where the ruined house once stood, something really beautiful could be built or could grow there. I think, we have an opportunity in this work to imagine a world that is more beautiful and is more just. that is place-based and grounded in justice. And we know that the systems that we're living in now are not that. They are unjust. They are not working. And so the opportunity to rebuild and regrow something more beautiful, I think, is a really interesting question. I guess the last reason too that I wanted to read this poem is because it was introduced to me when I was doing a really, really meaningful climate resilience and climate grief group last year that I began, I think, in February of 2020, so before the pandemic. So it was really interesting to be a part of this group starting before the pandemic and going into the pandemic. It was a 3-month class, but it was led by Rabbi Moshe Giventhal. And I benefited so much from thinking about this work, about the climate crisis, about what it means to be an activist, with his leadership and with the leadership of the other folks in that class, particularly thinking through the lens of the Jewish tradition. So I also wanted to uplift that and name their role. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what do you see in the work that you do now that is leaning into the spirit of this poem? Like, what is it in the work that you're doing now that is undoing the rightness or being the plow or trying to see what beautiful thing might be in place of the house?
This is such a good question, Cody. Oh my goodness. Well, when there's a good question, you really want to think about your answer. I think there's a few things right now that are I almost want to look at the poem again as you say this, being the plow, digging up the world like a mole or a plow, and doubts and loves. I think two things that we're currently doing that are maybe helping are the grief work that I'm a part of. That's one piece. And then also this emphasis currently on decolonizing climate justice as a movement, or really the climate activist movement, and viewing climate justice as an anti-colonial, just in an anti-colonial and decolonized framework. So in terms of resilience or in terms of grief work, I think, the climate crisis is just very heavy. Those of us who do this work carry a lot of anxiety, often carry a lot of depression, as activists or as scientists. And then those of us who are impacted, as, think about farmers or people who are being impacted by more severe storms, PTSD, anxiety, depression, suicide rates among farmers are just skyrocketing. So in order to be able to build something beautiful, and to move in that direction, I think we have to be able to hold ourselves gently and to acknowledge the anger and the pain and the sorrow of this moment, to name it and to be in community with each other. So I've been a part of these grief circles, beginning with the circle led by Rabbi Moshe Giventhal in February. And then since then, I've been doing similar circles for congregations alongside the Creation Care Alliance of Western North Carolina. I'm trying to really help people think about what they're feeling. I think so often we're outrunning that in climate activism, because we think we are either acting, we have this binary of either acting or feeling. And the reality is, I think that we can do both, and that we need to be connected to our grief in order to be grounded as activists. So I think that that's kind of maybe a funny bend on this answer, but I think that that's a part of it, and I'd be happy to maybe provide more context.
Sure.
But the other piece with decolonizing, I mean, that's a really clear, just the culture of white supremacy in America, the culture, white dominant culture in our country, and this kind of undergirding colonial structure that still exists within the United States is absolutely a part of what we have to address. I mean, it's a part of what not only we have to address, what we have to tear down. The ruined house, it is a ruined house that needs to be torn down. And so that work is really really instrumental and just so central, I think, to what it means to be thinking about this work as work of justice. And I guess a few people who've been helpful to me in thinking about that. Um, Ched Meyer's Watershed
Mhm.
Discipleship. It's a really wonderful book for those listening who are interested in reading about kind of decolonizing the environmental movement. He talks about being place-based and thinking about this work in a place-based way. Um, I'm also working with one of our interns, Noelle Bernier, to think about colonialism, how it's connected to environmental racism and climate injustice, and then what we do with that knowledge. How do we not only decolonize, but engage with the climate justice movement as anti-colonial? And that involves naming atrocities, and that involves moving from that reality, from that from the lived reality, just really naming the truth of this moment. And I think as a white woman, that's really vital for me as well, as a white Christian, knowing the way that Christianity has also played a role in colonialism. So.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the colonial structure that you're mentioning here and what, how should congregations, but also individuals or climate activists interact with that history and that
Mm.
structure? And what are the pathways to build something different?
Well, I guess I first want to name that, I am certainly not an expert here, that I am learning alongside many, many people. And that as a white woman, as I said, and a white Christian woman particularly, I know that I have a lot of unlearning to do. Um, but to speak to this structure, I think that there's a few things. So yeah, I'm going to begin here. So I had a really, really wonderful experience. I was a regenerate fellow through Wake Forest Divinity, and the fellows got to be a part of this really wonderful summer convening. And at that convening, I met an incredible woman named Nikki Cooley, who has become one of my friends and one of my most admired colleagues. She is a Navajo woman. And while we were in conversation about what climate justice means, she really helped me see something that I had never seen before, which is that in the predominantly white-led climate movement, which this is one section of the
Mhm.
movement, but in that white-led movement, there's a lot of violent language. Talk about conquest, talk about defeating climate change, of winning against it, of fighting. I mean, even just the language of fighting. We're going to fight this. We're going to win. It's this very white, very kind of settler colonial manifest destiny orientation to thinking about climate. And I had never really seen this or thought about that. And then the opposite, or the another approach that emerged from our conversations, was this idea of resilience and of adaptation, and of working with the world and working with our communities to love each other well and to live in justice. And that doesn't mean, not engaging in mitigation and climate mitigation work. We absolutely have to do that, but it's just a different way of approaching the conversation. So that's a piece of what this kind of is churning for me, what this brings up for me. Another piece, obviously, is, that we live on stolen land, that all of our land is Indigenous land, and that I think many folks in our country act as though Indigenous populations are no longer here, and they are. I grew up very, very close to Cherokee, North Carolina, right along the Qualla boundary with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indian. I grew up with friends and with folks, whose last name were Climbing Bear or Running Deer. And those folks being in relationship with our Indigenous neighbors is vital to how we decolonize, and not just being in relationship, but taking a step back and allowing those folks to lead us, to really listen and learn another way of doing this work. So I think being in relationship with Indigenous communities, and also our Black and Brown neighbors who are approaching this work in decolonized ways, is vital. So for congregations, I think that's a piece. Thinking about who you can be in relationship with, even just knowing what land you're on, an invitation to whose land are you on, whose land supports you and keeps you alive. That's a starting place. And then I think another invitation for congregations, particularly Christian congregations, is to begin doing that hard and long work of thinking about the ways that Christianity has been married to colonialism, and really twisted by, and there's just so much pain there, and really being honest about that, I think is a vital first step.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I mean, I think so much of it is taking the time to step back and to do a lot of listening and seeing that as white people, you're not trained to do.
Right.
You're never listening or seeing. That's not what you do. You just act. And so to take the step of actually seeing is definitely part of that. You started to mention anger, and in the beginning you talked about how there's sort of a binary between feeling and acting when it comes to eco grief. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how those two things intersect, but also for myself and for those of us who are tuning in, what is eco grief and what are the steps to hearing it, listening to it, dealing with it?
Yeah. So I think many of us, ecological grief is probably what we think it is when you hear that name, so it's the pain that we carry as people who are aware of the climate crisis or of our changing environment. So I think there's a lot of people around me in my neighborhood who maybe don't even believe in climate change, but who are feeling ecological grief because they are seeing seasons not come in the same way, or they're seeing drought, or they're seeing floods, and they are grieving those shifts that their bodies are aware of, whether or not they're naming it as climate change. Ecological grief, I think, is also social grief. Talking about binaries, how we often put social justice over here and environmental justice over here, but these are one and the same. And when we come together to talk about our ecological grief, we also talk about, the ways that is grief for each other. So we talk about poverty, we talk about economic justice, we talk about racial justice and white supremacy and white dominant culture, and we grieve those pieces of this work. And I guess what it looks like, Cody, it looks like a lot of different things. But the what I've been involved in are these congregational and community circles where we meet once a week and we have a teaching on an emotion. So we talk about anger or shame and guilt or fear, sorrow, hopelessness. We talk about those different emotions. We have a ritual where we name our sorrows and our joys side by side, so that we remember that both of these things exist together, and that they are not, that they can exist at the same time even. We go into small groups that stay the same throughout the course of our 7-week meeting, in order to talk deeply and to listen deeply. It's really a listening circle, an opportunity for people to name where they are with a particular emotion or what they're carrying. This isn't just a support group. It really is, from my own perspective, it has helped me so much in terms of my activism. Because when I talk about, that binary of action or feeling, I think so often in activist culture, we just shut down our feelings to a certain extent because we have to keep going. There's no time. And this, particularly as climate activists, like, there is no time, right? We say this all the time, that we're running out of time. So there's no time to feel this. There's no time to process this. We just have to keep going and going and going. And what that does to us is just deaden, our spirits and our connections to why we do this work. It really closes us off to our love for the world and for each other. So for me, engaging with this grief work, kind of the foundation of the grief work is the idea that, grief stems from love. We grieve because we love. So connecting to this, having a time to process anger and sorrow and move into integration of these feelings has allowed me to stay open as an activist and to dig much, much deeper without getting burned out, because I'm not outrunning my fear, outrunning my anger.
Mm.
I'm facing it, and I'm able to be grounded in that reality and really do my work in an open-hearted way. So
Yeah.
I think it's vital for those of us who are committed to this work to have some way through ritual or prayer or community to be thinking about these pieces.
It does seem linked to the sort of ideas, I mean, sort of rest as rebellion. Like I'm most familiar with
Mm-hmm.
it through sort of the NAB Ministries work,
Yes.
but the sort of grind mentality, or like there isn't time to stop, like you have to keep working even if it's a very important issue, actually sort of binds you closer to capitalism, binds
Yeah.
you closer to imperialism, and yeah, it runs you down. You can't do your work as effectively, and you forget who you are as a living, breathing being,
Mm-hmm.
not just one who produces work.
Right. I mean, I can't quote this. I don't remember. There's that wonderful quote about what the world needs are people who are fully alive. You might be familiar with that quote, but
Mm-hmm.
it's one that was often offered when I was in divinity school about vocation. You know, it was a way of thinking about what you might be called to do in the world. But I think it's applicable to all things. You know, the world needs people who are fully alive and awake.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires being fully human, and not, you know, mechanizing ourselves under capitalism or other structures of oppression. You know, crying tears, lamenting, hoping with each other, laughing with each other, joy. I mean, celebration can also be resistance to
Yeah.
still laugh.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love the work of the NAP ministry. I think
Mm.
it's just really prophetic and important.
Well, switching gears just a little bit, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about um, your theological tradition, your religious tradition. And, you know, you talked a little bit about your home congregation and where you
Mm-hmm.
grew up, but in terms of your religious tradition, what tools and theological musings help you shape your work and help you see environmental justice, creation care, work on climate as truly an extension of your religious identity and your calling?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many, you know, theologians and ideas that have helped me ground this work as work of faith. And I think that the first few, so as a student, I went to Appalachian State University in undergrad. And when I was first kind of coming into this world, I learned about the climate crisis, not in religion classes. You know, I learned about it
Right.
in science classes and
Right.
sociology classes. And so I was sort of piecing the religious aspects myself. I didn't have a class on that. And the first people that I found were Fred Bonson and Norman Wurzba. So the first kind of theological voices that came into my world were these voices predominantly around food,
Mm-hmm.
but that were thinking ecologically in a faith-based way about the food justice issues and, you know, food deserts and relationships to the table and communion. And they spoke to my heart, absolutely. And I ended up going to Wake Forest, and Fred Bonson was my advisor there. And then when I was there, I got a lot more of the theology, because then I was able to take classes on ecological theology. And I think maybe the two overwhelming voices for me, maybe Sally McFaig and her work around the earth as God's body. This idea, the body of God is one of her classic books, and just this idea that God is just, I guess sacramental theology is really, really vital to me, that we are experiencing God and the love of God all around us all the time. You know, bread can be that presence. Snow, there's snow outside my window right now. Snow can be that presence. Dirt, soil, living soil can be that presence. And then another theologian that's been really vital to me is John Sobrino, who's a Latin American liberation theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And liberation theology is really at the center of my theological orientation. And he has a really incredible book called Where is God? Earthquake, Terrorism, Barbarity, and Hope. It is one of the most powerful books that I've ever read, really, really centered and kind of thinking about empire and decolonial structures. And he has this notion of the crucified people. So he talks about the crucified people and how Jesus is today being crucified all the time in the ways that we treat people who are oppressed and who are impoverished. So that idea that, you know, like George Floyd is Jesus on the pavement, who's been killed by the police, or Michael Brown is Jesus on the pavement. The child on the border is Jesus, you know, in a cage. Because that notion of the crucified people has been an incredible orienting force in my life, especially around the climate crisis, because we know that it is the poor and are, you know, the most marginalized among us who are feeling this first and worst. So it's just that idea as well. And I mean, I could like go into all these other verses, right? Like and the Greek and the Hebrew, and I love Ellen Davis, and there's just a lot of really wonderful people out there. But John Sobrino's concept of the crucified people is just a driving force, certainly.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Well, you do a lot of different work in your role at North Carolina IPL, and one of them that you're doing kind of both in North Carolina, but also as an aspect of Southeast Faith Leaders Network, is this work on climate resiliency.
Yeah.
And sort of both the resiliency, probably when people think about it most, we think about it in terms of like structures, like physical locations. How do we be resilient in the face of climate disasters or something? But I know in particular, you've been doing a lot of work on spiritual resiliency, kind of in this, how it's connected to climate resiliency. And so I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how those things are connected, both the physical and the spiritual, when we talk about climate resilience.
Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, physical resilience, I think, is what we think of when we think of climate resilience. That's, you know, having a emergency evacuation plan, knowing kind of the layout of your buildings, knowing where people could be sheltered during a storm, all of those pieces. And those pieces are vital. I mean, we absolutely have to have the hurricane kits and the plans and the contact people in place. Like that is just of immense importance. Spiritual resilience is connected in some ways, I think, to that grief work, to being just in connection to how hard this is, so that we can feel strong in the midst of the storms of our lives that are, you know, literal. And there's also this huge emotional weight of these moments. It's not just that your roof gets blown off. It's that, oh my God, that's trauma. You know, that's very, very disruptive and scary. So the spiritual resilience looks like helping people become, you know, trauma informed. And we have I work, the North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light is also a program and a campaign of the North Carolina Council of Churches. So I'm really, really grateful and blessed to be able to work with a team who do other things around the state. And one of my colleagues, Jessica Stokes, focuses on mental health, specifically trauma. So one of the things that spiritual resilience means is helping congregations become trauma informed, understand what an event like this is going to do to their community emotionally, and then how they can listen to each other and be present to each other and provide, you know, the mental health support in terms of connecting them to professionals that will be needed in the wake of those moments. Jessica worked on the coast for many years in Wilmington, North Carolina. And, you know, we saw children who, after a hurricane, were no longer potty trained because that was traumatic. We saw people with PTSD, all of these different, you know, pieces. So becoming trauma informed as a congregation and understanding what mental health care might look like and destigmatizing mental health care is a piece of that. I also think that spiritual resilience, and this is something that I'm taking from our friend and colleague, Avery Davis Lamb, the best of us. So a wonderful, wonderful person and leader. I love what he talks about around climate hospitality. So Avery talks about the importance of, faith communities often talk about hospitality. They may even have a hospitality team or a little group that,
Right.
bakes cookies at church to give to newcomers. And this emphasis on hospitality should also be something that we think about in the wake of storms and climate impacts. How are we going to care for our community when they no longer have a place to go, or when their home is flooded, or when they have to leave their home because they can't live in the place that their families lived for 7 generations anymore? It's just not an option. So thinking about hospitality in that way, I think, is a spiritual question. It's a question about who we want to be and how our values impact whether our doors are opened or closed. So when I give presentations to congregations around the state around climate and faith and these various issues, one of the things that I talk about is hospitality. And if you live in the mountains like I do, are you going to be able to welcome climate migrants? Because they will likely come here. And, is your building prepared for that? If you're redoing your building, maybe put in a shower, put in some spaces where you can really be a good neighbor and a welcoming force and a force of hospitality. And if you live on the coast, what does that mean for you? Or in the middle part of our state, in the Piedmont, what does that mean for you? How can you be practicing this hospitality in a radical way?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because we were talking before this call about kind of prepping for some sermons, and I was one of the things that I'm not preaching on, but that I was thinking about was kind of the Noah story, but as it relates to right now, that there's sort of a God's people are sort of set up in a world in which they know that the world is going to change, and we can choose now to be prepared for that change in a way that that helps people adapt to that. Like you're saying, like we can make choices now for things that we know will happen in the next 10 to 15 years. And when that happens, we won't be able to make those changes. We won't be able to live into climate hospitality if we don't prepare with the foresight that the world is changing and God is calling us to be prepared for that change. And I think that that's a good point, Sarah.
It brings us back to that poem, where the ruined house once stood. What are we building?
What are we building?
What are we building here? Do we have the tools we need?
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, and I'll ask you just one final question about, so your email signature holds a quote from H. Sheldon Smith, the first president of the North Carolina Council of Churches. And the quote reads, "Liberate us from cowardly fear and deliver us from moral complacency in these confusing and perilous times." And the quote seems apt for this conversation, apt for this moment, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to say a little bit about that and why you think it's applicable as we leave our time.
Well, I think we're having this conversation in 2021. When I began the Council of Churches, we were working and living under the Trump administration, just with horrific injustice every single day, seeing children put in cages, seeing it was just really horrific. We know this. And it's still, I'm not saying that it's better now either. I mean, things are better. There are things that are better now. There's some hope maybe that wasn't there, but we were still living in a culture of white supremacy. And these are confusing and perilous times, right? I mean, there's so much misinformation right now. There is so much division that has been sowed by misinformation. And I think the power and we have the opportunity to be prophetic, to prophetically speak to love and courage and to what it means to be a good neighbor in this moment. And I hope that we are courageous and that we do speak and stand up for what is right, even amidst pressures or powers, people in power who are saying something that is not true and that is harmful and that is oppressive. So I guess that quote I think it's really interesting that the first president of the council said those words so many years ago, and they are so relevant today. And I guess that also speaks to why, things haven't changed that much. There's just so much work to do.
Yeah.
And I hope that we can be the prophetic voices that we are called to be. And that's really the mission of the council. So it's just sort of an underscoring of that.
Yeah, it definitely, I mean, as we leave this conversation, it circles back to the kind of thoughts about eco grief and taking the time to see what you're doing. Because if you take the time to explore your feelings and to be honest with yourself about how you feel and where you are,
Yeah.
and you're able to come alive a little bit more, then you're able to live into this sentiment, to be liberated from cowardly fear.
Yeah.
And be delivered from moral complacency.
That was a very helpful bow on the end of that, Cody. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on the show and giving us
Absolutely.
some of your time. Thank you,
Yeah, it was
everybody,
good to be with you.
for tuning in. You can find us next week, the same time, same place, for another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. We'll be interviewing Ken Winston of Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light to hear about the victories around the Keystone Pipeline. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.